Joining us now to discuss all of this is the Executive Director of Guns Down America, Igor Volsky, and Community Organizer and Advocacy Director at the Community Justice Action Fund, Greg Jackson Jr. He's a survivor of gun violence. We appreciate you both taking time out to come on the show tonight. Greg, let me start with you. President Biden has pushed for more reliance on community-based violence interruption programs to help reduce this kind of crime. He's encouraged state leaders to invest funds from the $350 billion in assistance included in the American Rescue Plan. How do these programs work? I know there's limited involvement from the police. Explain to us how they work and what evidence there is that they work.
Yes, so thank you so much for having us. I mean, these programs are extremely impactful. And so when we think about what a community-led violence interruption program is, we're talking about programs that provide services and support to victims after they're traumatized by an act of violence. One of the biggest indicators of whether or not someone will act out violently is were they a victim first. And so there are programs that support victims who have been impacted by violence. Like myself, I'm a survivor of gun violence. But when I was shot, there was no trauma services. There weren't those types of resources to help me navigate that trauma and help decrease the likelihood of retaliation. We're also talking about programs that do community outreach and are literally engaging individuals when conflicts arise and de-escalating that situation and mediating those conflicts before it becomes fatal. Too often we know what can turn into a fatal event or activity, but we just don't have the community leaders or community messengers to intervene and de-escalate. And violence interruption programs are extremely effective at doing that. And then the last big model that we're talking about here are programs that use cognitive behavioral therapy strategies that help shift the mindset and the lifestyle and the behaviors of those who are most at risk. In every major city, we've seen that less than 2% of the population is connected to 80% of the violence. And so if we know who those individuals are, let's proactively engage them and work with them on life skills, getting them the therapy, the support, the help, the job training, the life skills to prepare them to shift out of that lifestyle. So these programs are extremely impactful. In certain cities, they've reduced violence by upwards of 60%. And the whole focus is how do we proactively get to the individuals and get to the people before we have to bring in law enforcement, which ultimately is a reactive strategy.
That's a very good point. Igor, let me bring you in. What would you say sparked this post-pandemic nationwide surge in violent crime, specifically gun murders? Because obviously the violence interruption programs that Greg mentions, they were themselves interrupted by the pandemic. You have Republicans pinning it all on the defund the police movement, even though the rise in violence isn't limited to cities that cut or even tried to cut policing budgets. So where do you put the blame or the cause for all of this?
Well, part of the cause, frankly, is the dramatic spike we've seen in gun sales all across this country from the very first days of the pandemic to today. That's incredibly troubling because we know all of the research shows where there are more guns, there are more gun deaths. And let me just say about the programs that Greg outlined, we've known about the incredible success of evidence-based community programs for years, but it's because of the leadership of Greg, the leadership of community leaders, the amazing coalitions they've put together of community groups and national organizations that we're now seeing this president embrace these programs, advocate for funding for these programs. And of course, we also know that along with this important life-saving funding, we also need to tighten our nation's gun laws. We got to make those guns harder to get. And that's where we frankly need to see more leadership from President Biden and the Senate Majority Leader.
And Igor, just a follow-up on that. I mentioned this a moment ago to Colorado State Representative Tom Sullivan. But do you think the Democrats have been too slow to paint the Republican Party as soft on crime because of their refusal to pass basic gun control at a time when, as you say, gun sales are up and gun murders are going up?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. On one hand, you have Republicans trying to blame the increase in crime on President Biden. On the other, these same very lawmakers aren't just opposing very standard expansions to our nation's background check system, but they are trying to vote down the appointment of a lifelong gun safety expert to lead the only agency, the only federal agency in this country that's responsible for firearm trafficking, for cracking down on gun crimes, guns that are trafficked and are then used in crime in some of our major cities. So you can't have it both ways. You can't scream and yell about law and order and reducing homicides and then do everything in your power to actually make homicides worse.
Yes, very good point there. Greg, we know communities of colour in particular have been over-policed and not necessarily protected from violence while being over-policed. It's increased a lot of the mistrust between communities of colour and law enforcement agencies. A poll conducted last summer by Data for Progress found 78% of voters support violence interruption strategies, 71% of voters, including 6 in 10 Republicans. Why do you think we never hear anything about this stuff then from the Republican Party? Why is it they just want more police? Is the message not getting through to them, or is it just not convenient?
Well, I think America as a whole has a problem with only seeing violence as a crime issue. And when you look in the Black community, for example, 68% of homicides are not connected to another felony. So if you're only looking at this from a law and order, let's crack down the crime approach like we did in the 90s, which failed, then we're missing the point that to end gun violence, we need a comprehensive strategy that looks at public health solutions, that looks at helping those people who have been traumatized by violence, that looks at getting to the problem before it happens and ultimately address the root causes. I think one big thing we overlook is that the reason that gun violence spiked in 2020 was, yes, gun sales, but also because the root causes of violence increased. Our economic situation was in the worst it's been in decades. Housing has been unstable. Access to food and resources and safe spaces were disrupted, and that directly impacts the likelihood of violent acts to happen. And so we really, really think that this is something important and something that Democrats and Republicans can support. The Alabama Attorney General actually put out a statement, a Republican put out a statement and said we should increase funding for these types of programs. And so we're seeing leaders starting to wake up. But we need them to not just wake up, but to take action and invest in these solutions if they really care to save our lives.
And Greg, community violence interruption programs, or CVIs, have drawn criticism from some law enforcement groups who say that as a result of retirements, resignations, police departments are the ones who need more staff, more resources, more support. How do you respond to that argument?
You know, this isn't an either or. This is either or. If this is a matter of resources, the president has already signaled that he's willing to pay and invest in these strategies. And so if the goal here is to really save lives, we need to invest in everything we can to address violence. Representative Sullivan said it before that there's a real cost of violence. And that's true. In America, our economy is impacted. We lose $280 billion a year connected to gun-related violence, homicides, and injuries. So this is not a matter of where the money is or if we have enough money or where it should come from. It's a matter of priority. Are we funding peace? Are we prioritizing lives? Are we willing to invest in these communities that have been neglected and overseen and overlooked for so long? You know, the 6-year-old that was shot, she was shot right down the street from my house. And this is the same neighborhood that's struggling with economic issues, the same neighborhood that has schools that are failing, the same neighborhood that has housing issues. But yet you can pass 6 police cars and go to a school that doesn't even have a working field or a track or enough school resources. So you can't just look at it as an either or. We have to invest in these communities because the dollars are there. The urgency is not.